Hi, everyone. Jennifer Gardner. I am the Director of Regulatory and External Affairs at Hydrostor, and I'm here to talk about wildfire risk mitigation and utility liability. I think Stephanie did such a nice job kind of giving you a lay of the land. One of the things that I've already been asked a couple of times is sort of why I'm here talking about wildfire risk. For those of you who are not familiar with Hydrostor, which is not surprising because we are a Canadian-based energy storage company. We do long duration energy storage, which Stephanie just spoke to. We do have an interest in ensuring the resiliency of the grid. And there are obviously many ways that utilities can ensure resiliency. One of the ways in which they're doing that is looking at what we call non-wires alternatives or non-wires solutions, of which energy storage is one. So as you listen to my remarks today, I'll be going through a lot of mitigation options. I'll also be discussing liability, theories for utilities. Keep that in mind. That's kind of the frame of reference that we're coming at this from. So this is the presentation overview. I'm not going to spend too much time on this so that we can get through to the Q&A as quickly as possible. Again, I know that the prior panel before lunch spent quite a bit of time talking about wildfire risk and probably talked a lot about the statistics, so I don't need to go through that right now. But what I will note is I live in Park City, and I was preparing for this presentation yesterday, and I was looking out my window and obviously was seeing the wildfire smoke gathering most of the day, and air quality was obviously quite horrible. Due to the wildfire that was developing in Tooele yesterday morning. And then we had regional wildfires as well. So I was just curious to check what the current stats are for wildfires in the West. And I was actually, pretty surprised, although I shouldn't be, given that I've been working on these issues for a number of years. But, more than 70 large fires were burning across the US as of yesterday. I mean, that's quite a lot. And actually more than 70 across the entire country, with most of those being in the Western US. And so far this year, fires have burned through almost 7 million acres across the country, which is the largest acreage to be burned at this time in the year since 2018. And I'm sure the Camp Fire has come up already, but 2018 was, of course, the year of the Camp Fire in California, which was the largest and deadliest in California history, and eventually led to PG&E, a utility there in California, seeking Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. So speaking of bankruptcy protection, speaking of utilities being found liable for these wildfires and catastrophic events, I want to dive into some legal issues that hopefully will not be too boring for our audience. I want to start off by noting, though, that there are these very different legal liability theories that apply either in California or in the rest of the West. And so when we're in California, we're looking at a concept that's called inverse condemnation. This is a form of strict liability. And what that means is essentially that you can hold a defendant responsible for the outcomes of their actions, regardless of their intent or mental state. So this means that we're going to theoretically find utilities liable for wildfires a lot more easily in a state like California than perhaps in other Western states. I'll explain why that is in a second. Outside of California, wildfire claims are typically founded in allegations of negligence, and so you cannot rely on strict liability. So on the slide, you can see negligence in this case means the utility owed a duty of care. They breached that duty. The breach caused the damages, so damages to property or damages to a person. And the harmed party can actually prove those damages. So that is an elevated standard that is not considered strict liability. An example of negligence in one of these cases would be a utility's failure to improperly design or construct, inspect, repair, or otherwise maintain the equipment that they have control over. And of course, we've heard stories of transmission lines triggering wildfires in some instances. So you can see where it would be logical to use a negligence standard here. Before I move on, I want to note something else, which is the regulatory model for a lot of these utilities. When I talk about PG&E or Pacific Corp or Rocky Mountain Power, which you'll hear a lot of these names throughout my remarks, I'm talking about privately owned utilities or investor-owned utilities. We call them IOUs. And they are highly regulated by state entities that are typically called state public utility commissions. These state public utility commissions, or PUCs, have authority over rate setting. And it's very significant because the utilities typically recover the costs of almost all of their expenditures including capital expenditures to maintain power lines, modernize the grid, and implement wildfire mitigation plans through customer rates. So keep that in mind as I go through the remarks, especially at the end when I talk about some of the plans that PacifiCorp has. So one of the first lines of defense for a utility when it comes to wildfire risk and mitigating that risk is having insurance, right? We have health insurance, we have car insurance, home insurance. It's no different for a utility. They have a number of insurance options. This is not the exhaustive list. These are the most commonly used options. In the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about 3 of these: funded self-insurance, commercial insurance, and recovery bonds. And happy to answer questions when we get to the Q&A portion. But funded self-insurance is pretty self-explanatory, but the utility will retain all or a fraction of the risk by setting aside adequately funded reserves to cover unexpected losses, like those stemming from a wildfire, and restoration costs. These typically come in the form of a wildfire reserve account, but some words of caution on this: it takes time to build up adequate reserves, especially when we're talking multi-billion-dollar settlements. And also state regulators are becoming more reluctant to approve these kinds of insurance models because of the fact that rates are the mechanism by which the utility ultimately recovers the costs. The commercial insurance option is traditionally used to cover wildfire risk and is very commonly used. The cost of insurance coverage, again, is typically distributed to the ratepayers' bills as wildfire premiums. Interestingly, as we've seen wildfires become more devastating, more frequent, particularly in the West, we're seeing companies show reluctance in issuing these policies. So this either means that they are minimizing the amount of insurance they're willing to give, they're increasing their rates, or in some cases, they're not even insuring utilities at all. So that leaves us with other options, which again, we can talk more about in the Q&A. I wanted to talk quickly about recovery bonds because these are unique in that utilities are using these after a disaster. So it's a post-disaster risk financing mechanism to actually try to pay for the damages stemming from those disasters. An example of this would be in 2018, state legislation was passed in California that allowed the utilities to pay for their wildfire liability costs through the sale of state-sponsored bonds. So once we get past that first line of defense of insurance for the utilities, we're looking at 2 large categories of mitigation options for utilities so that they never get into a situation where their infrastructure is responsible for igniting a wildfire and then responsible for damages. The first category is enhancing the wildfire prediction methods that they have. And the second category is grid management options. So within wildfire prediction methods, not surprisingly, we have wildfire prediction methods, very obvious. We also have early detection of wildfires and the timely detection of fire-inducing faults, not fire-inducting faults. That is a typo. So wildfire prediction, typically we're looking at what are called logistic regression models. And what they're doing is they're trying to predict the likelihood of ignition occurrence and, of course, the location of occurrence. The factors that seem to increase the likelihood of fire ignitions include population density, human accessibility, land cover, and elevation. When we're talking about timely detection, the early detection of wildfires, the image shows you a satellite image from a NASA and NOAA satellite. This is a low orbiting Earth satellite, and it's able to send these images down to Earth in under 60 seconds to detect wildfires right after they are ignited. And timely detection of fire-inducing faults, I'm actually going to address on a later slide when we talk about PacifiCorp's wildfire mitigation plan. So the second large category is the grid management options, including grid asset management, vegetation management, public safety power shutoffs, and wildfire monitoring and tracking. I know we had a speaker from SDG&E earlier, and I saw his slides. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to listen to his remarks, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because I'm sure he covered this in quite a bit of detail. But one thing I want to note is that when we talk about the public safety power shutoffs, that is a really unique consideration, and there's a lot of things that a utility has to think about before initiating those. One thing would be that it's a preemptive measure. It's designed to prevent a wildfire from even starting, and they're only going to do those as a method of last resort. So these other methods they're really trying to focus on before they ever even get to the public safety power shutoff. Obviously, if you're turning off power to an area that needs that power for critical facilities like hospitals, that's going to be a high risk in and of itself. So a utility really has to take a calculated consideration before initiating a public public safety power shutoff. That is a mouthful. We will talk a little bit more about some of these options when I get into PacifiCorp's plan as well. So in the interest of time, I am going to move. Okay, so PacifiCorp's wildfire mitigation plan contains a lot of the elements that we've already talked about: asset hardening, meteorological enhancements, emergency management plans, risk modeling, EFR protection settings, public safety power shutoffs, and vegetation and line management. Just to do a little bit of level setting, PacifiCorp is a utility that operates in 6 states. Within the state of Utah, it's their subsidiary, Rocky Mountain Power, that's operating, and they also operate that subsidiary in Wyoming as well. So for asset hardening, before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about the concepts of relays and faults. I'm sure most of the folks in the audience are familiar with those terms, but I needed a refresher, to be honest. It's been a while since I've gone over this. So relays are basically system settings and switches, electrical switches that are designed to protect electrical systems from damage caused by changes in current, essentially. So an overcurrent, an undercurrent, and overload. And then, of course, a fault is an abnormal condition in a power system that causes an improper flow of current or voltage. So an example of this, which I hadn't thought about before I started preparing my remarks, although it should seem quite obvious, is a lightning strike. It can cause a high voltage surge, and that will damage equipment and lead to line faults. And all of this, of course, increases the risk of wildfire, and more specifically, a utility's equipment being linked to that wildfire. And so for asset hardening, I think it's worthwhile just being specific on what PacifiCorp is intending to do. They are wanting to rebuild their overhead lines with covered conductors so that conductors are not implicated in wildfire ignitions, or they want to underground those lines. I'm sure the representative from SDG&E talked about this. That's obviously very expensive to underground lines. So if there are other options you can take before that, that's preferable. They also want to replace old relays with microprocessor relays. So what this will do is enable quicker fault detection by the utility, and it will limit the amount of arc energy, which is essentially just heat, that is present in that fault event. And finally, they want to install additional reclosers with all updated fault detectors, which are very similar to relay settings, and they want to use remote capabilities to reduce wildfire risk while minimizing the outage impacts. So that is a part of asset hardening. I think the meteorology considerations, emergency management considerations, and risk modeling ones are pretty obvious, but can go into detail on that in the Q&A. What I will say is the enhanced fire risk protection settings, these are more sensitive protection settings that look very similar to the asset hardening protections that PacifiCorp is already planning to do. And again, the idea here is to be able to detect those heat events, those sparking events before they occur, so that we can reduce the chance of utilities actually being responsible for wildfires. Really quickly, just to kind of put a bow on all of this, Utah did pass legislation this year. It was SB 224, which went into law on May 1st, I believe, and it allows Rocky Mountain Power to actually establish a wildfire fund. So this is the latest sort of string of events for Rocky Mountain Power in trying to reduce their liability tied to some wildfires that they've recently experienced, but also looking forward and reducing their risk in the future. So the Utah Fire Fund will not be a replacement for self-insurance or commercial insurance, those two options I discussed on a prior slide. And also, it requires approval by the Public Utilities Commission. So I talked about how much authority these utility commissions have. They will have to give sort of the go-ahead to do this. If it's approved, Rocky Mountain Power could collect customer surcharges over 10 years, which will total up to $1 billion. When we look back at what PacifiCorp was found liable for with the Camp Fires, $1 billion would barely scratch the surface, but it's a very good starting point for a utility looking into the future and trying to reduce their risk. So thank you very much for your time.